AM 1460, the new WXBR, Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva here with you on a Monday morning. Mike, one thing that you and I have decided to do from the beginning of the inception of the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM, as we like to call it, we branded ourselves a little bit with our names, is we've liked to bridge the past with the present as we look towards the future. The new AM 1460 WXBR, obviously earning a lot of its old listeners back, accruing some new listeners on top of the already established listener base from the previous incarnation of this radio station from the old studios at 60 Main Street. And we've liked to have had a lot of former WXBR radio personalities on the airwaves who we've remained friendly with throughout the years, just to have them on to talk about old times and whatnot. We did that with Steve Mason. We did that with Charlie Bergeron. A little later on this week, we're going to have former Brockton Rocks pre- and post-game show host and play-by-play commentator Matt Futrell join us just prior to the start of Brockton Rocks baseball next weekend at Campanelli Stadium. One person who you and I never crossed paths with in any of our time at the old WXBR, dating back to the WBET days, is a woman named Betsy Zullas. With that being said, we've always heard the name Betsy Zullas from a lot of longtime listeners. When you and I would go to remotes, we would often hear, we'd always hear, "Where's Charlie? How's Charlie doing?" We'd also hear from time to time, "How's Betsy Zullas doing?" And I had no idea what to tell him. I don't know. I've never really met her. Until a few weeks ago, Betsy Zullas came into the studio, introduced herself to us. We got along great. And joining us now is a woman formerly known as Betsy Zullas, now known as Betsy Clague. Betsy, thank you so much for joining us here on this Monday morning.
Good morning, and thanks so much for asking me to come in.
Betsy, how long were you here at WBET, as it was now known, or then known, at the old AM 1460? And how did you get involved? Because people seem to remember you like they spent a substantial portion of their life with you, which I suppose they did, waking up every morning.
That's the biggest surprise, I suppose, because I was in the news business right after I graduated from college in 1984. And I had the great good fortune of working in local television, and at that time there was a nightly live newscast that we had done, and then moved part-time into radio, working at the wonderful FM radio station on the South Shore for a little while, but also working at WBET, first on the weekends, doing some production as well as news, and discovered that I really had an affinity for news gathering and for local news. And then had the opportunity to do the afternoon drive newscasts. It was a drive time program, and I did the news portion of that on WBET, and I think I started doing that.
That was with Steve Mason, if
that's right.
Correct.
That's right. I think that started in, I want to say, 1988, because after I had left local television, I'd gone to Channel 12, WPRI television for a while to work on the news desk, and then came back to WBET to do the full-time afternoon drive news portion of the programming then, and that was a wonderful time. And I had training in the business from some of the very, very best people. The legendary Tom Rolstone, who is no longer with us, but he was the morning man. He was the morning newsman with Doc Jones, dating back to Doc Jones.
That's another name we hear from time to time when we're out and about doing things with the station in the community.
And a half a pint of milk.
Oh, I knew someone was going to do it.
And Tom Rolstone trained me over at the other wonderful FM radio station that I did news at. I was trained by not only the owner of that station, but also a great, great newsman named Dave Clark, who's also no longer with us, unfortunately. But they were real old-fashioned news people, and I learned news gathering, broadcast news gathering for radio from them. So I was very lucky.
Now, how long were you at the original AM 1460 from? You started in the late 80s.
Late
when did you
80s. I left in 1998, I believe. 1997. Went to WPRO AM in 1997 to 98. And by that time, I'd started a part-time law practice that grew much more quickly than I'd expected. So it was time to transition into being a full-time trial lawyer.
Now, you were doing the afternoon drive news portion of that program with Steve Mason, who was the host of that show. For some time, didn't you also do the morning news with Charlie Bergeron?
That's what I'm saying,
mistaken?
yes. I transitioned into morning drive news after Tom Rolstone left in 1989 or 90. It was, and so I was doing the morning drive news for 7 or 8 years at WBET.
See, that's why I think a lot of people remember Betsy Zullas, because of the tag team of you and Charlie Bergeron every morning as they woke up. For some reason, and I think this is a compliment to both you and Charlie, people remember and miss you guys after all these years.
It was, we called it the Face for Radio program. We had worked together in television before that, so it was not our first opportunity to meet or to work together. And the first newscast was at 5:30 in the morning, and then the show got underway. Initially, it was music, spinning records, and information. And then it transitioned over into more conversation, although my part was always news. I was never an official talk show host there, but I filled in both on the Conversations program that Marion Roble did at 11 o'clock every morning, and on the Newsline program when Bill Alex was unavailable, sometimes during the holidays. And in fact, it became a little bit of a regular thing for me to have Santa Claus on the air with me during the Christmas season when Bill Alex was on vacation, and I had the great good fortune of having Santa Claus join me from the North Pole. From time to time, Mrs. Claus would join them. We would promote the show, and we got call after call after call after call, children telling Santa Claus what they wanted.
Well, very cute.
In the middle of the week. It was, it was a wonderful thing.
Betsy, you mentioned your affinity for news gathering. Can we get a little inside baseball here, and can you give listeners a little inside look into how you gathered your news? Because now there's internet. Your news is at a click of a button.
Oh, she had the AP wire machine, I bet.
I had the AP, but it was also a lot of shoe leather, a lot of shoe leather, and obviously what we tried to do, and what we were in a position to do at the time, although never as much as we wanted to, was to break local news, to know what was going on. And again, I had the opportunity to work at some larger market broadcast facilities too. So, some of what I had started to do in the local markets that I worked in was expanded on there. For instance, I would listen to one scanner during my morning shift at WBET. When I worked for the major market Providence station, it was like the 28th market in the country at the time, there were 3 or 4 scanners. When I worked at the television station in Providence, there were 9 scanners that we had to keep track of, and there was a listing of all of the police departments that were on the scanners. We never ever went right from scanner to story. However, we always had to verify whatever we could through talking to the police departments. But before we went on the air at 5:30 in the morning here at WBET, there was a process of, for the most part, visiting, sometimes calling the Brockton police station, and calling about 20 other local police stations to try to get them to tell us, what had gone on the night before. And usually we were successful, especially after we'd been doing it for a while, after we'd won a few awards, after they'd heard some of our coverage on, the major Boston news station, or even in CNN in Atlanta, because we were a CNN affiliate at the time. We did have the Associated Press Wire. We contributed to the wire services often there. And we also had early morning printouts from the local newspaper. We did not depend on them to a great extent, but they were helpful in following up. Sometimes we would get the stories right from there, but normally what we did is we would contact the players in those stories as well. We also, whenever there was a school committee meeting, we had the cooperation of the school superintendent at the time, who wasn't averse to receiving a phone call at 6:15 in the morning asking to talk about some of these items that had been on the agenda. We had received the agenda of the school committee prior, and it got mailed to us, by the way. We didn't, we couldn't pull it off a website. And so I'd look at some of those agenda items and I'd say, geez, we've got contract negotiations coming up, or, certain important things that seem important. Let's see if I can hear from the superintendent and maybe from the head of the union, because those can give you different perspectives. or some school committee members who may have been involved. We also did that with the city council. And when I was doing the afternoon drive, part of my job was to go to the city council meetings and the FinCom meetings and sit there for the whole time.
Oh,
and
the FinCom meetings can be brutal to sit through as well.
They can be,
Brutal.
but you had an agenda. You knew what things were important, and so you could actually report on what you saw. Then I was able to get some interviews. Sometimes I would get them that night. Sometimes I'd make arrangements to talk to people who were featured on those issues the next morning. But usually what I would do is go back to the station, leave stories with sound in them, with recorded sound, and they would be run by Tom or whoever was doing the morning news. But, there were a lot of terrific news people who worked for WBET through the years. There was Paula Matrano, there was Jill Toronto, there was John Machado, of course, who was with the station for years. So there was a great tradition of providing coverage that people really, they demanded it, they insisted on it, and they got it. And one of the areas in which we shined too was in local weather coverage, storm coverage. I know Charlie talked to you about the blizzard of '78.
I was going to ask you, Charlie Bergeron seemed to reminisce about the blizzard of '78 as being one of his fondest memories of having some camaraderie and working with people at the old WBET.
That was his. I'm a little younger than Charlie, and so
come till the 80s.
My greatest weather broadcasting memory was again at the that wonderful FM station over on the South Shore. Hurricane Gloria hit, and I was new to radio broadcasting at that time, and I was just a weekend news anchor reporter. And the owner came in and said, "Get into the talk studio. We're going on the air. We're going live." And I was panicked. I said, I'd never been on the air for that length of time. I didn't know how to ad lib. I was 22 years old and had no experience really in radio anyway. And but we did it, and we were able to connect people with the services they needed. The South Shore communities were devastated by that hurricane. The owner went out with some of his equipment and called in live when there were electric utility trucks that he felt were sitting in a restaurant parking lot for a little too long. There were people who needed baby formula who didn't know how to get it, would call in, and somebody would call and say, "I've got some. I can meet you at a particular place." That went on for the better part of 2 hours, and the station won an Associated Press Continuing Coverage Award as a result of that. And WBET won a couple of Associated Press awards as well. So it not for that particular storm, but on other occasions.
Once again, we're chatting with the woman formerly known as Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR, now known as Betsy Clague, as you have married since your days here at AM 1460. Didn't you actually marry towards the tail end of your days at AM 1460, but you kept the name Zullas? I
gave birth toward the tail end of my time at 1460, but I married before that. It's just that my husband Dan and I were married in 1987. Last year celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, it's a year-long celebration. And but to change my name would have been very confusing at that time. But I always wanted to take his name, and when I had the opportunity to start a law practice, it seemed like a natural transition.
Mike and I have the most hard-to-spell names in all of radio.
Yes,
we should
you
have
do.
really considered this before we went with our real names going there. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva. How many people screw it up with the Twitter handles? I can't find you. I swear to you it's there.
We should have thought about that beforehand.
Yeah, we didn't put too much insight into how people would respond to our last names. We should have talked to you before this all happened.
I went with my real name when I first went on the air because I was too young to know better, and
that's what we'll chalk it up to. Too young to know better.
And the fact is that I'm sixth generation in this community, so I had the great advantage in terms of not only gathering news, but also the great kindness with which I was received in this community. Some of that came from being a kid who was from here and knowing what matters to this community and knowing what this community is, because I grew up here and, like I said, sixth generation here.
Once again, we're chatting with the woman formerly known as Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR, now known as Betsy Clague, former news person at the mighty AM 1460 WBET back in the day. As
a real heritage station. It really was. It was around for so long, and so many immensely talented people passed through the doors there. It was a real honor to be associated with WBET.
You did one thing that Mike and I are both very appreciative, and we've never mentioned this on the air before.
Oh, great.
But maybe within the first week and a half of us being on the air here at the new AM 1460, kind of still trying to find our traction, find our ground, find our role here with this radio station, find out if people actually knew we were back, you sent us a very kind note. And we had never met you before.
Well,
thank you for that.
You're welcome. That was based on how different and how professional, how profoundly professional your handling of that particular subject was compared with CNN and the mainstream media.
Should we mention what the subject is?
It's up to you. It's
yeah,
your
there was within the first week and a half, that's when the Steubenville rape case was heavily in the news as the convictions came down to those teenagers who were involved in the case. And you and I just kind of opined on not so much the story, but the way in which the story was covered by a lot of national news outlets. And we got a very nice note sent to us by you, and we were very appreciative of that.
I'm glad you remembered it, and it matters a lot that we try to have a sense of fairness and a proper perspective, especially when it comes to reporting on crime, on major crimes. And it was clear that the ordeal of the victim had been completely ignored. Not only ignored, but there was so much hostility, as you had pointed out, toward the person who was actually the victim. And instead, the mainstream media was talking about the convicted rapist as though, their lives are ruined and their victim. Well, there's some agency connected with what led to their lives being ruined. And frankly, now that there's been convictions, I'm more interested in the healing of the victim.
I could agree with you wholeheartedly. Once again, we're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR, former news person here at AM 1460, now known as Betsy Clague, but we'll call you Betsy Zullas for the sake of not confusing the listeners.
There are those who still do, so feel free. I am amazed at the extent to which there is a local memory of the program, the Face for Radio program that Charlie and I. Really, it was Charlie who, he was the station manager at the time.
Which a lot of people did not know until we had him on the program a few months ago at this point and interviewed him.
He was my boss.
People never realized that. It surprised me to this day.
Because he made me coffee in the morning. He certainly didn't. He was a terrific teacher. But also gave me so much freedom and free rein to develop the news gathering capabilities of what we did, and that's what led to, again, award-winning local news coverage.
Betsy, this is the second time, to my knowledge, you have ventured into the new studios here at 250 Belmont Street, substantially different from the old studios at 60 Main Street, where you spent your years at AM 1460. What was your thoughts on, we'll say, the downfall of the initial station, the reemergence of the new station, and the compare and contrast of the two facilities?
Boy, that really is some inside baseball, huh?
People seem to love it when we talk to Charlie, so I figured I'd ask you as well.
I have to say that you're only going to get out of local radio what you're willing to put into it, and that is in any size market. And I think we're seeing some fascinating things happen in the Boston market and trickling down to, this is a mid-size market, a mid-city market is what the designation was for the Associated Press and radio and television news directors' purposes. And so it means putting effort, putting work, and putting some money into training, into talent, and into resources so that in order to keep it going. When WBET obviously began in 1946, there was no television. Everybody got the information they needed from radio. But radio has not only continued to remain relevant much to the surprise of those who thought the internet would just put it out of business finally. The fact is, we're coming back to local communities and the kinds of local communities that were held together with the glue of local radio. And smart people in the business are recognizing that. I've kind of avoided your question because it's talking about the inner workings. I can say that if ownership is not willing to put the resources, and I don't mean spending millions of dollars on fancy equipment, but to put the resources into basic maintenance, having engineering on staff, having a sales force, having and connecting with the community. It's just going to be another, rip and read, satellite-driven operation. And I remember every time we imposed more network programming, those of us who were on staff would push back and would be very concerned that the whole place was going to end up becoming an automated 24/7, somebody flip a switch and then leave kind of place. I had the good fortune of not being there. That didn't happen. I mean, we worried about that creeping in, but that didn't happen because the community supported the station. There was an AM and an FM station at the time, and the ownership recognized that there was a community importance to what was being done. And that does translate into dollars for ownership. That's how you make a profit, too. Good business doesn't mean good radio is also good business.
Once again, we're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. Betsy, we're going to step aside for a quick breather, do a local news update in just a few moments. I want to keep you on for another segment or so, and we want to talk to you a little bit further about your experiences at WBET back in the day in the mighty AM 1460 and your transition out of radio into what you're doing now. And I think that what you're doing now can equate to a lot of news stories that took place in recent weeks on the South Shore and some big ones that will be happening in Boston over the next week or so. So stay tuned. You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva here with you on this Monday morning. We're joined in studio by former WBET radio personality Betsy Zullas. Stay with us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. AM 1460, the new WXBR. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva still here with you on this Monday morning, joined in studio by former WBET news person Betsy Zullas.
Good morning.
Keep saying WXBR, WBET. It was hard for me to get used to saying WXBR when we initially made that jump X amount of years ago at this point, but now I find myself having to correct myself when I am trying to reference the old WBET.
That it's been known by other names as well, wasn't it? WBKW one time, way back, or
we were WBZB for about 6 hours.
Yes,
do you know the story?
I do know the story. I do. And when you were talking about the inside baseball aspect of connecting with the community and the differences between the old days that I appear to represent now and what we see now, it is so important for radio stations in general to be to have the opportunity to have the dedicated people who work there have the resources that they need, at least the minimum resources. We're always going to want more. We're always going to want things to be better. We're always going to want a bigger staff. We're always going to want cars. We're going to want, the very latest in equipment. But we've got to meet certain minimum standards. You cannot expect people to work in an absolute sweatshop where nothing works and everything's held together by chewing gum and spit. And
and fruit flies are abundant.
And that was never necessary. That was never necessary. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have devolved to that point.
Once again, we're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. We'll stray away from our inside baseball talk, but we'll keep the focus around some issues with the radio station, the old WBET, the new WXBR, AM 1460, however you say it. Some stuff I think the listeners might be interested in hearing. You mentioned that you and Charlie Bergeron, who, 9 years, did the morning program together?
Yes.
You and Charlie Bergeron did the morning program for 9 years. You look at me quizzically. I think it was
because
9.
I'm trying to do the math now. It was like 1989 to 97, so maybe it was 8.
Maybe it was 8 years. But a substantial portion of time, you and Charlie Bergeron handled the morning show at the old WBET. You mentioned before that you two had worked in television together, correct?
That's right.
So it's Continental Cablevision?
That's right. In 1985, Continental Cablevision. No, it was prior to that, 1983, forgive me. The first program, first bit of local programming aired on Continental Cablevision, and it was coverage of the very locally important and very well-attended St. Patrick's Day Mass at St. Patrick's Church. And that was their debut of local programming. I became an intern there when I was finishing up.
Just some inside, just some background information. This station, Continental Cablevision, went all over the South Shore, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. And it wasn't, and there were local programming departments in every town.
So it's not like public access, if that's what people are kind of getting at.
This is very different. Because what the cable companies would do, and there was competition. And cable companies would compete for the licenses to provide cable services to municipalities. And so the municipalities had the opportunity to negotiate contracts with these corporate interests. They were able to have a contract drafted and signed and agreed upon where, in the case of Brockton, among the provisions was that Continental Cablevision would provide the funding for a local programming department. And there would be a local board that was in charge of that. Although the board was appointed by the mayor, there were also provisions that prevented local officials from controlling the programming in that department. Minority affairs programming was important. It was an important part of the part of that contract, and I was the minority affairs producer when I was there. A local live newscast was what we put on the air with local news coverage. And the greatest thing about that is that when I was hired in that department, there were about a half a dozen people there, some of whom were already television professionals who were able to train me and some of the other youngsters, the newcomers, in how television and how television news actually operates. And so it was from that springboard that you had a nightly live newscast that aired for several years.
At that time, the two main staples of Continental Cablevision, and keep in mind, I was young, but the two staples that I remember was the newscast, and what was the other one, Mike? Do you recall?
I don't.
Another Night with Ron Van Dam.
Right. That started, actually, I don't know what year he started doing that, but I think it had started while I was still there, although by 1987, I had gone to work at WPRI Television at Channel 12.
So you weren't there did you and Ron ever cross paths at that time?
I don't recall that we did. So he may have started his show while I was still there, but most of what I did there predated that.
Because what I was going to get to was that the newscast would air, Ron's show would come on, and sometimes in Ron's show, which was a comedic variety television program a la The Tonight Show or David Letterman or something like that.
Except locally produced. How wonderful.
Locally produced, live. They had great bands on. It was a very cool programming.
Sure. And he's a professional.
Ron Van Dam is a professional. He's a guy that took that job very seriously. But one thing that I always thought was really funny was Ron would mock the newscast that came on before him sometimes. And I was wondering if you were ever on the receiving end of any of Ron's good-natured zings.
I wish I had been, but I think the work that I did was before that. There was a live nightly newscast for several years after I left. And in fact, several years later, after I became a mom, I know they did a segment, and by that time I was with WBET full-time in the morning with Charlie. They did a segment on, a new mom working in the broadcasting field and trying to handle both, and featuring my son and I. And again, that was several years later. He was born in 1995, so that was mid-90s.
So she may or may not have crossed paths with Ron Van Dam, who transitioned from television ultimately into radio. You and Charlie worked in radio, or television prior to you worked in radio. What are some of your fondest memories of working here at AM 1460? Whether it be on air or off the air.
Well, I know that there were some major news stories. There was some major news coverage. Those, and not always of pleasant things, but it's coverage that we became proud of. There was when I was working afternoon drive, we received a tip in the newsroom one day that the chief of police was under arrest. And we went down to the courthouse and saw that the chief of police had been arrested for stealing cocaine from the evidence room of the Brockton Police Department. And at that time, and it was a very chaotic situation. There had been, there was no historical precedent for that locally. And so we put together some news stories. We broke in, and people who were driving home, because it was very typical for people to listen to the station on the way home from work as well as going into work. There was an afternoon drive presence, and the coverage continued into the next morning. I remember that when there was going to be a court appearance the next morning, this was a chief that I had dealt with pretty frequently, very often, to get information about crime stories. And I just remember, sticking the microphone in front of him and saying, "Did you steal it?" And he said, "I have a drug habit. I'm on drugs." And his lawyer was outraged that he had opened his mouth, but he had, and there were a lot of people there. And then he said, "I believe in the system," and so that became news coverage that was played in a lot of markets, because that was a big story, that there was a sort of admission. That was a time when there was a lot of local drug dealing. There was a lot of violence on the streets connected with drugs, and there were some 300 or so drug dealing cases that were thrown out in Plymouth County because of that. So the things that we're seeing now related to that, we've seen before.
Any other news stories stand out in your mind from your time at the old AM 1460?
Oh, there are many. There was a series about the lack of local regulation of lead paint in apartments where young children were living here in the city of Brockton. That was exclusive to our coverage, and that was something that we had won an Associated Press award for. But I think that our election coverage, which was really, blanket coverage, and it included some cooperation with local officials, but also just, we had the whole news staff, which at the time was 3 or 4 people who were employed as news people through different shifts throughout the day, and then interns and other people associated with the station reporting from different places, including City Hall, where the votes were actually being counted. So we actually were able to bring, and I know that a lot of the campaigns and a lot of the a lot of the campaigns had the live local news coverage on the air, and that's how they were getting their information. They didn't have to rely on phone calls from their own checkers who were at City Hall, because we were able to put it on the air. So we had a lot of that was something to be very proud of.
You haven't covered a local election until you've had to stand outside City Hall waiting for the Elections Commission to give you the official numbers for the evening, have you, Mike?
That, it took a lot of negotiation. It took a lot of really kind of persuading people who were in charge of their government fiefdoms that this is really good for all of us.
Once again, we're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR, talking about some of the old times at the old AM 1460 WBET. Let's talk about some fun off-the-air moments you had with your coworkers, Charlie Bergeron, Steve Mason, a number of others. Here's one that has been told many times to me throughout the years. This is where I heard your name more often than not. This might be your legacy, Betsy, within the actual station.
I know what you're, yes. Okay, go ahead.
You were the pitcher of the WBET softball team. I'll let you take it from there.
I had never pitched in my life. I had played softball in high school, but I was a third base player. Okay, so Bill Siebert was the station manager at the time, and he'd put together a softball team to play the U.S. Postal Service. Now, guys who take their softball seriously, by the way, the U.S. Postal Service.
It's a heated rivalry.
It was one game to raise money for muscular dystrophy, and so it was being aired live. The big remote truck was there. Steve Albert was live on the air with it. Steve Albert, who worked evenings, who I know you've heard of as well. And so I was just pitching during our warm-ups. And then Bill said, no, you take the mound. You can pitch. And I said, Bill, I've never pitched a game. But I was a good soldier.
It was a managerial decision in this part.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And so I pitched, and I think it was the first batter. I don't know. It was a lot of years ago, and I suffered a head injury. So I could have been halfway through the game. And I was the only woman on the team, too. That was the other thing. My husband was in the stands with the wives of all the other players. And I pitched to a U.S. Postal Service hitter who proceeded to smash a line drive that hit me right between the eyes. I went down on the mound, and then, I looked up. I don't think I ever lost consciousness, but I may have. I looked up, and, I saw my husband's face, and I couldn't believe he got there that quickly. And then
maybe you don't
decided,
remember the time you were out between when he came.
No, and then, well, because he was there watching the game, but I'm thinking, how did he get over that fence?
He ran really fast.
He ran really fast, and apparently jumped really high. And so then I decided that I had to go to the emergency room instead of having my ups. And I remember muttering something about not getting my ups. And one person that I saw as I was being, led away to the emergency room was Brockton Police Sergeant Winthrop Farwell. So this is before he was ever mayor. He looked at me and said, "Oh, no, Betsy." And then, they took me off to the emergency room where I sat for a little while and got some treatment. And I ended up with 2 black eyes.
And this was live on television?
Radio. This is radio.
Okay. I thought you said the big... I thought you meant Continental Cable.
No, this was WBET.
Who won the game?
I don't know. I don't know
There's
to this
some
day, but I got
postal worker right now saying, "We won."
The guy felt terrible. I felt bad for him because what I was told was he was just a wreck over it, and he hit a line drive. He didn't do it on purpose. It was just fine. But yeah, it was so. I was told, "Oh, you can't go to sleep if." For a little while, and if you feel nauseous, call us. And it was, I've had very few injuries in my life, only a few. So it was a little disconcerting, but funny, I suppose. Funny in retrospect, of course.
So they did live play-by-play of the U.S. Postal Workers versus WBET
to raise money for muscular dystrophy, yes.
Who did the play-by-play of the game?
I think Steve Mason was. I don't think it was as... not Steve Mason. What am I saying? Steve Albert. Steve Mason was on the team. But the guys were so nice to me about that. They really, there was a lot of camaraderie about taking one for the team. And I think, although I don't know that was a thing at the time, I don't think that was an expression. I ended up getting a trophy out of that. I know it was just because I got hurt.
Because you got drilled.
Yeah, because I never got a chance. Hitting was something that I was good at. So I really wanted my ups, and it never happened.
Steve Mason recounted some interesting stories to us of his origins at WBET, of participating in radio remotes from his front lawn for a number of years.
Yes, the front lawn remote. Yes, that I didn't go on many remotes. Usually, I was back at the studio doing the newscast.
You weren't privy to some of the fun because of your newsperson position, huh?
Yeah, well, that's okay. That's all right. I was. That was the job that I had. But the treatment around the station was, beyond compare. The sense of really teamwork was extraordinary. And routinely people would go above and beyond what you thought that they would ever be expected to do, and would show a remarkable not only grit and discipline and an ability to work hard, but talent.
You weren't refereeing ladies' wrestling matches like Steve Mason was back in the day as part of WBET.
No.
Appearances.
I was not doing that. No, I think the Santa Claus. I had the opportunity to do some lighthearted things when I substitute hosted on the programs, and I think the one that, if anything is to be remembered, and I wouldn't expect any of it to be, but if anything's to be remembered, I think the Santa Claus segments on the Newsline talk show. But also, there were some wonderful segments that Charlie came up with, that he put together. And, Tabloid Thursday was one that became just legendary. One that originated out of the news department was called Stupid Thieves. Now, I know now that there are newscasts and there are programs where they feature little segments about criminals doing very stupid things, and I'm here to tell you that originated on WBET 1460. One time I called the police department, the Brockton Police Department, in the morning, and they were giving me the story of a home invasion where, and that was going to be a lead story at the time. We had, the greatest number of homicides, murders that we had in the city when I was working was 12, 16 when I was working there. So that was not something that happened often. So a home invasion, that's a serious crime. That's armed assault in a dwelling. Somebody comes in waving a gun, threatening you. That was a major news story. And the police told me a story about a woman who had been the victim of an armed home invasion and gave a description to the police. And the police actually went and found a guy matching that description, put him in the back of the cruiser, brought him to the woman and said, "Is this the guy?" And the woman identified him. And when the defendant, now the suspect who was arrested based on that identification, was brought back to the police station and booked, he said to the officer, "How did you know it was me? I was wearing a mask." And so I told that story. It became not only a news story, but it became the origin of Stupid Thieves. So Charlie and I would then routinely, because people liked it so much, well, not the lawyer for the defendant. He didn't like it at all. He called up yelling and screaming. But Charlie so enjoyed being able to talk about the stupidity and the laziness of some criminals that it became a regular thing. We would call the wire reports and, the 3 newspapers that we each read every day to see if there was a story that we could talk about between newscasts.
Ultimately, you had to make the transition from being a radio news person to what is now your profession of being a lawyer. What led to you leaving the radio profession, and how did you ultimately make that decision?
Well, I have had the great good fortune of working in 2 fields, having 2 careers that I've loved. I had the opportunity to go to law school, and for a long time I'd wanted to be a trial lawyer. And so I went to law school, worked very hard, and, my husband and I did that instead of a mortgage when we started out. And he went to grad school, I went to law school, and then I opened my own practice here in the city of Brockton. I had the again, good fortune of getting a lot of wonderful mentoring from people who are in the community who are attorneys, and started practicing law while I was still working in radio, although at that point not at WBET.
I was going to say, did it ever conflict?
No, because I worked in Providence, but I don't practice law in Providence. And most of the stories that I covered in Providence were Rhode Island stories. So then, and it was interesting because, I was a little younger at the time. I worked a morning shift there as well. So I would get off at 8:30 in the morning and go off to court. And I would be wide awake, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, whereas often my, person on the other side would be a little less alert. So it worked.
It worked to your advantage.
It worked to my advantage. The practice got busier more quickly than I expected, and I had to make the decision, a little reluctantly, that I'm gonna do this full time. So that was when I left radio, and I don't think that I would say that I miss it necessarily, but it was, being in the news business was...
You like sleeping in, don't you?
I do like sleeping in. I don't get out of bed before 6 o'clock in the morning.
Can't say the same for myself anymore at this point, Betsy.
Generally, yeah. Generally, I don't get out of bed before 6 o'clock in the morning, so...
Once again, we're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. Betsy, transitioning from your radio career into your legal career, we'll talk a little bit about how that can equate to some information and insight you can provide for us on some stories happening in the area in regards to stuff happening at courthouses. Want to stick around?
Happy to do that.
You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva here with you on this Monday morning. We'll step aside for a breather. Mike Paiva joins us with a local news update. Back with more of the show with Betsy Zullas after this. AM 1460, the new WXBR. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva here with you on the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM, as we like to call it. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at PM in the AM Boston. And you can check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/PM in the AM Boston. Best place to hear archived interviews and segments from this particular show. We're continuing on our conversation with Betsy Zullas, former WBET radio personality here on the Metro South Morning Show. Perhaps your son will follow us on Twitter. You're not into Twitter, are you, Betsy?
No. I don't do Twitter.
You have a law practice that doesn't even have a website, Betsy.
That's right. That's true.
Is that you just the last of the Mohegans just saying, you know what, I'm holding out. No internet presence for me.
Because I am busy enough.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
busy enough. And
I guess that's not a bad thing.
That's not a bad thing. And, having a trial practice means that a lot of what we do, we're still doing the old-fashioned way. Now, I know that there are some lawyers out there who say, I'm working toward having a paperless office and a paperless practice. And, in fact, there are some courts, I know in the federal court where I have been practicing since before the year 2000, in the federal court, all of our filings, with very few exceptions now, have to be done electronically. So I've had to master those systems, and I've done that. But having a web page means I'd have to update it daily in order for it to be any good. And the work that I do on behalf of clients doesn't give me the time to do that.
Once again, we're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. If you're just joining us, Betsy Zullas, former WBET news person who transitioned from her radio career into a career as a lawyer. Let's talk about some things that have happened lately involving lawyers, since you can provide some interesting insight. Past few weeks, big story in Brockton at the courthouse, the Keith Luke trial. Keith Luke, not allegedly, he was found guilty Friday of committing some rather heinous acts late 2009 where he shot and killed two people based on the fact they were non-whites, and he also shot another person and raped them. They did manage to survive. They are still alive, and they actually had a victim's statement that they read in court on Friday. What were your thoughts on that trial from the defense standpoint? Because you're a civil lawyer, correct? More than a defense lawyer?
I do some criminal work, but most of my cases are civil. But most of them involve intentional misconduct. And I represent many people who are victims of criminal acts and victims of or civil wrongs, which are known as torts. So I was, from the perspective of the survivor of the Luke attack, I was just overwhelmed at her courage.
She had to go before everyone and speak about this.
That's right. And when it comes to rape, when it comes to sexual assault, the vast majority of people who are victimized will never be in a courtroom because there will never be a case about that sexual assault. But when there is, it is daunting. It's very difficult for the prosecution to bring the case to trial. There are all kinds of obstacles that exist just with regard to rape cases that don't exist with other cases. And to the extent that happened here, I thought the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office did an extraordinary job giving the victim an opportunity and the survivor an opportunity to confront what had been done to her, confront who had done it to her, and to get some justice, some closure. Although there is no doubt that her life will never be the same. And I pray, as I do for, anyone who is a survivor of abuse that I represent, that more good than harm comes of it for her. It was nightmarish. And of course, during her testimony, he is smirking.
I was going to say, he was straight out of a movie as a villain, smirking, smiling at some of the most grotesque, gruesome parts of the trial being discussed. He seemed to almost be taking joy in the fact that it was coming to light and being spoken about.
And I know it's been said that it was all an act on his part to try to appear crazy, but one of the first things he said in a not one of the first things, but one of the things he said in a recorded prison telephone conversation was that when he was talking to his mother, and he said, "I'm not some crazy.
Right.
I knew what I was doing. I did that," and they were allowed to use that. One of the interesting things about this case that hasn't been talked about too much is that it's already been up and down from the Supreme Court 3 times.
To finally get to the Brockton courthouse?
What happened was there were lots and lots, and lawyers endure an awful lot in the way of pretrial proceedings. And in fact, most cases, civil and criminal, don't get to a point of trial.
Didn't they want to change a venue at one point?
There was a request for a change of venue that was rejected. Mm-hmm. There was a request to throw out the indictments by his defense attorney, Joe Krowski Jr., who is a terrific lawyer, by the way. He is a very, very good defense lawyer. And I, as a Brockton person, as a mom whose kid was in a school that was locked down because of this series of horrific acts the day after the inauguration of President Obama, as someone who witnessed this in horror and was horrified on behalf of our community and especially on behalf of the victims, I have to say that I am so glad that he got the trial that he got. And I'm so grateful to the Commonwealth, to the jury especially, to the survivor and their family members, and to his defense attorney, because I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Keith Luke is sitting in prison now for the rest of his life. There's no hope of parole for him. He's been convicted of first-degree murder. People think, people who...
2 life sentences and many years on top of that he got.
There is no chance of him being released. And not only that, his name, his words, his politics are going to be forgotten.
Now, you mentioned his defense attorney, Joe Krowski Jr., a very good defense attorney, in your opinion, you just mentioned. I know him a little bit. I've had some personal interactions with him, always pleasurable. I don't know him too well. From an analytical standpoint, they tried to plead insanity for Keith Luke. Good strategy?
Real Hail Mary pass. It was all he could do. And in fact, I wouldn't suggest it's not legitimate. In fact, Keith Luke had a serious mental health history. With 6 months before these acts, he was hospitalized after he had threatened to kill his mother. So there were some who had diagnosed him as schizophrenic. But I think at the end of the day, what the question came down to is, did his mental illness deprive him of the opportunity to conform his conduct to our society's expectations, to know the difference between right and wrong, and to act on that? And Joe was not able to prove that was the case, because his mental health expert, who's someone that has been connected with some cases that I've had, suggested and opined after his interview of him and reading all of these medical records that he was insane, that he couldn't conform his conduct to our expectations. But then the Commonwealth came back with experts who said, he's got a personality disorder, okay? Maybe several, but he's not psychotic. And he knew what he was doing. He planned it. And he was not, whether or not he was mentally ill, whether or not he had personality disorders is not the question. The question is, did that mental illness interfere with his ability to know right from wrong and to control his conduct? And the jury, I think quite rightly, after 7 hours of deliberation, found that in fact he wasn't insane, he was evil. He was an evil guy. He is an evil guy who has some mental health problems.
In some circles, the verdict may have sparked a controversy into the reinstatement of the death penalty. Any thoughts on either which way on that?
The death penalty is what he wanted. This is, and I'm not going to, wade into that debate except to make this observation. Keith Luke made it very clear that what he was hoping for was to be killed by the police, was to be martyred, okay? The last thing he wanted was to be sitting anonymously in a prison cell and in a prison environment, and being irrelevant and unimportant and just another inmate for the rest of his life. That's what he's got. He is no longer important. He no longer matters. If he were given the death penalty, he would have been another martyr to the white supremacist cause. And that cause is out there. Make no mistake about it.
The death penalty almost would have been too nice for Keith Luke.
Well, it
would have been what he wanted.
It's what he asked for. It's what he asked for. It's what he wanted. So to give him the death penalty would have been giving him what he wanted.
Sometimes when you see cases such as the Keith Luke trial, locally, more nationally, that get a lot of press and media attention, more often than not, or maybe not more often than not, but maybe the ones where it happened stand out in your mind, that the jury just got it wrong. Was there ever any doubt in your mind heading into the verdicts being announced late last week in relation to the Keith Luke trial that the jury would get this one incorrect, in your opinion?
I believed, based on my review of the case, and again, I wasn't in the courtroom every day, but I believed that there was going to be enough evidence to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt of murder in the first degree, notwithstanding any mental health issues. So that was my thinking of what the verdict ought to be. And when the jury was out for a couple of hours, the longer the jury was out, the more I was thinking, oh my,
I thought the same thing.
Have they been convinced that...
when we didn't get a verdict on Thursday and had to wait till Friday, I started having some doubts as to what they were going to do.
But my sense of it is that the jury did not really deliberate for very long on Thursday. I think it was only a couple of hours.
They started at like 2 in the afternoon.
And then they were sent home sometime around 2:30. So I think that there was, some people estimated that the jury was out for 7 hours. I don't think they actually deliberated for quite that long. Although at this point, even, whether it's 3 hours or 7 hours, one of the points that Attorney Krowski made was, well, I'm sure they didn't read the whole 4,500 pages of mental health
I saw that quote as well.
Records. And my response to that is, it would be pointless for them to, on their own, without the guidance of the expert witnesses, try to, on their own, interpret these clinical medical records. And this is a mistake that is made over and over and over in courts and in the media, having people who are unqualified, sometimes people in robes, sometimes judges on the bench who are unqualified to interpret medical, clinical information, make all kinds of judgments about it. And so I don't think it was necessary that the jurors pour over 4,500 pages of medical records.
Well, I'm sure Joe Krowski's probably glad that one's over. That's going to be a 2-week ordeal. What did he have to work with there? That was an almost impossible ordeal for him. He was literally given an assignment that was almost impossible for him to complete.
Well, it's never, if you can protect the rights of your defendant, if you're a believer in our justice system, that's never a waste of time. People say it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, why don't they just euthanize him now? Because that's not who we are. That's why. So I think that, Joe Krowski's defense of Mr. Luke is really to be, on the whole, commended. Because he worked so hard. Because I have, as a Brocktonian, as a citizen, as somebody who drove by Warren Avenue and saw people who I'm almost certain were the jury not sneaking out, but being let out the back door while all the news trucks were in front. I just, saw folks filing out of the courthouse shortly after the verdict, and I just mouthed thank you to them because I thought they were heroic and took seriously their work. And the vast majority of jurors do. It's not easy. You always hear about people trying to get out of jury duty. And by the way, jurors in that case are losing sleep today because of the detailed information, the photographs, the images that will never leave their minds. That is something that whether you are a police officer, a prosecutor, a judge, a defense attorney, or a juror, is very, or the court officer handling the evidence and hearing all of the testimony. That's something that has an effect on people that the general public is really not particularly cognizant of. And I thank the people who are willing to be confronted with that kind of trauma-inducing material on a daily basis, and people who are willing to care about it. Because, there are far too many people within and outside the system who would just rather look away.
And you mentioned that the ordeal not over for his defense team just yet?
I don't know if Joe Krowski will be handling the appeal, but somebody will, because the conviction, where it is a first-degree murder conviction in Massachusetts, automatically reviewed by the Supreme Court.
Well, we'll see how this all plays out, as unfortunately for us, we have not heard the last of Keith Luke's name mentioned on our airwaves. As
you're going to hear a lot less of it. You're going to hear a lot less of it. And there will be a postscript somewhere. Oh, by the way, Keith Luke's conviction in this superb trial presided over by Judge Gaziano has been upheld by the Supreme Court.
Well, we'll be hearing less of Keith Luke and more of Whitey Bulger in the coming weeks.
Yes,
that's right. That's
more
right.
of Whitey Bulger. First off, Whitey Bulger captured, what was it, 2 years ago at this point?
Yes, it was. Just under 2 years ago.
I remember on a Sunday night being at a place I was staying in Bridgewater and watching television and seeing it scroll across the screen and my jaw dropping, because it was the last thing I expected to see on a Sunday night, scrolling across my television set. Why has it taken so long from then to now to go to trial?
That's only 2 years. That's not such a long time, and especially when you are talking about the extraordinary amount of evidence and reports and paperwork and number of witnesses that the government wants to call in this case. And I know that Jay Carney, the attorney for Mr. Bulger, has repeatedly sought continuances based on the fact that I think he felt. And again, I'm not in his mind, but just as an outside observer, it would appear that he was concerned that he was going to be rushed to trial in this case, especially in any kind of a case where there is a trial coming up or where you're getting trial ready. Each side has the opportunity to look at the other side's evidence, and sometimes one side will just give you stacks and stacks of material, very little of which is relevant, knowing that going through it is as hard as trying to determine how you're going to counter it. So, that's a tactic and a technique, and I'm not saying that the government was doing it here, but I don't think it's unreasonable, too, that Attorney Carney would say, listen, I've got stacks and stacks of paperwork here, and I can't possibly get him the fair trial that we all deserve, and that, in particular, my client deserves, unless I have an opportunity to go through this.
Well, given your insight into the world of the legal system being a lawyer and your insight into the media world having worked as a news person in both radio and television in the past, there's some interesting questions I want to ask you after the upcoming news break in regards to the Whitey Bulger trial. Do you mind sticking with us for one more segment?
Happy to. Thank you.
We're joined by Betsy Zullas this morning here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. You are listening to the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva. Stick with us. Mike Paiva is going to join us with a local news update. More with Betsy Zullas after this. AM 1460, the new WXBR. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva here with you still on this Monday morning. You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show, PM in the AM. Remember, you can follow us online on Twitter at PM in the AM Boston. That is our Twitter handle. And you can also check us out on YouTube at youtube.com/PM in the AM Boston. Best place to hear archived interviews and segments from this particular program. We're joined in studio by former WBET news personality Betsy Zullas, now working as Betsy Clague as a lawyer in the Metro South area.
My office is in Brockton, right on Main Street.
Well, tell the folks how to get in touch with you if they need some legal assistance.
Well, listen, feel free to call. I'm at 142 Main Street, Suite 304, Law Office of Elizabeth Clague. And, I'll tell you, I work in about 8 different counties in the Commonwealth, as well as in the federal system, so and the administrative agencies as well. So it's a busy practice, and certainly people can contact me that way, 587-1191, in the 508 area code is the number. Thanks for the opportunity for a plug.
So busy that you don't even have a website because you can't have time to work on your website because you have to do so much work with your clients. You must get more work than you could possibly take on sometimes.
I do. I refer business out. Not every client that comes in the door is a good fit for my office and for my practice. And that's one of the most important things, and that's more art than science, making that determination. But I have to tell you, the first federal case I ever had contact with was not as a lawyer and not as a radio person, but as a news producer and news anchor at Continental Cablevision when the former DPW commissioner was indicted by a federal grand jury and was actually tried for corruption in U.S. District Court in Boston, which was at the time located, we didn't have a Moakley courthouse. It was located right near Post Office Square. And the way I covered that, because of course I had to write the newscast working with the other staff at Continental Cablevision, and then we had to go on the air with it. But late in the afternoon, after the evidence, every day had been completed, after the court session had been completed, I would make telephone contact with the prosecutor in the case and then and find out from him what were the most important developments in that day. And then I would call defense counsel, who was Larry Siskind, here in Brockton. And he would tell me what he thought the most important developments were that day. So between those two, I would tell the viewers what both of them had to say about what happened in federal court that day. And we'd show video of the sewer treatment plant and, of the person who was on trial. And that was how we covered that trial. And I was able to get very updated information right before we went on the air with our live newscast in the afternoon. That was my first contact with federal practice.
Well, we're going to have a lot of contact with the federal courthouse over the next few weeks and perhaps months as the case of Whitey Bulger goes to trial this week in Boston. This is a trial which obviously is going to have a lot of interest, particularly here in Massachusetts and nationwide as well because of, we'll say, the legacy of Whitey Bulger, if you will. This trial could take some interesting twists and turns as it goes about.
The hurt that has been inflicted on South Boston, on families here in the South Shore and in the Boston area by Whitey Bulger and the organized crime operation that he ran, and every person he came in contact with, is something that families and survivors are determined is not forgotten. It's a very difficult case for the government to prosecute because there was such corruption in the FBI at the time, and counsel for Whitey Bulger, Jay Carney, is making sure that people don't forget that and trying to take every opportunity he has to tie Whitey Bulger's reign of terror to this idea that somehow he had an agreement with feds as an informant for them, that he could do whatever he wanted. That's his position. It seems to me...
It seems preposterous.
Well, like the Hail Mary pass of the insanity defense in the Keith Luke case, this too seems to me to be quite a bit of a reach.
I don't think anybody has... I don't think anyone's above the law with just the ability to kill and get away with it.
Well, and a federal judge in the case agreed, and the First Circuit Court of Appeals... to some extent agreed, but one of the twists and turns that's been very interesting is that the case has been reassigned from Judge Stearns, who was a member of the U.S. Attorney's Office during the years that there was this alleged relationship. There was a relationship with Whitey Bulger. The First Circuit he refused to recuse himself, and then the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which I've actually been in front of, said, you got to. So they have a new judge in the Bulger case, and I believe it's Judge Denise Casper, who, if I'm right about that, is a wonderful judge, really bright, not easily intimidated, does not bend in the face of bluster from either side. So if I'm right that it's been assigned to Judge Casper, I think we can look forward to some order. And that's the thing that members of the general public, until the first time they're in a courtroom, whether it's right here in Brockton Superior Court or in federal court in Boston, when they're in a courtroom, it's all business in those courtrooms. And these are serious people. These aren't people who are shooting off their mouths and speculating. These are people who have done the work, who have done their jobs, and have a further job to do. And they're not particularly interested in what people are saying on the outside. So it's an interesting juxtaposition.
We're chatting with Betsy Zullas here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. Tell us about your experiences in federal court and how that might, and what experience you've had in federal court and how that would impact your insight into this Whitey Bulger case coming this week.
Just that, there have been, I just recently settled a case there. Most of my work there is civil in nature. It's about intentional misconduct. I had a trial there several years ago in a case where it was a time when I was very comfortable. I had already been comfortable practicing in federal court, but the people on the other side, I had initially filed an action in state court, and they thought they'd remove it to federal court, because they thought, oh, well, that'll really knock her off her game. And I was very comfortable there. And we ended up having, an 11-day trial, and judgment came down in favor of my client. But the very hard thing about that case was that we walked into federal court on a day late in September, and the judge said, I'm going to give you your trial, and I'm going to give you a trial in 3 weeks. We're going to start. And so I got to go from the very beginning of litigation that I had just written. I had just written the case. I had just written the complaint a couple of weeks before to actual trial of the case within 3 or 4 weeks. That's how it happens on TV all the time, but that's almost never how it happens in real life.
It happened that way for you. You've been on TV. You're not just a lawyer, and you don't play one on TV.
I don't play a lawyer on TV. No, that's true.
You mentioned you did a case that lasted 11 days. I have to imagine this Whitey Bulger case is going to take significantly longer. What's ultimately going to happen here, in your opinion, as it's about to start? What would be your prediction as how this is all going to play out?
He's going to be convicted. He's going to be convicted. It's going to be a long trial, without a doubt. There are going to be a lot of witnesses. However, not nearly as many as defense counsel and the prosecution, for that matter, have led people to believe that they're going to call. There have been these articles in the Boston papers about how all these newspaper columnists are going to be called as witnesses. I'd be surprised if there's a lot of that. There's a lot of self-important speculation by folks out there who, again, once they get into the, rather sterile, somewhat precise, modulated voices of the actual courtroom will realize, you know what, this is a much more disciplined proceeding than I ever would have believed.
Is Whitey Bulger in jail for the remainder of his life?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's not getting out.
What about his girlfriend, who was also captured along with him in Los Angeles 2 years ago?
Yeah, her appeal was just rejected by, well, no, appeals don't get rejected, but her plea of guilty and sentencing was the subject of an appeal, and the decisions that were made in the trial court were affirmed just recently by the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and I think that was the right decision. And it's very, very unusual and difficult to get an appellate court to look at an agreement you've reached and say, I want a do-over.
She managed to maintain a home in Quincy, I believe, throughout the years that she was on the run with Whitey. I found that bizarre that she still had property that she owned in the area.
Well, that was her sister's home.
It was her sister's home.
Her sister's home. I'm not ready to say that she is somebody who was at all times acting of her own accord by any means. But there was a guilty plea. There was a sentence. There were opportunities for her to conform her conduct with the law. And it was determined that she rejected all those opportunities, that she made choices.
Having been both someone who has worked in the media, whether it be in television in Providence or in radio here on AM 1460 years back, and someone who now works as a lawyer, are you interested in seeing how news coverage of this plays out? You and I were talking during the break. The first big court case that I can ever recall in my lifetime getting a significant amount of media coverage was the O.J. Simpson case. They allowed cameras in the courtroom. It was broadcast live on the E! Network. It spawned the birth of Court TV, which no longer exists, but had a significant and healthy run of covering court cases. That sort of turned into a circus. At the federal level, this Whitey Bulger case won't be that.
No, there won't be. There won't be cameras in the courtroom. First of all, the federal courts don't permit it, and I don't see them permitting it anytime soon. In Massachusetts, the state courts do permit cameras in the courtrooms, but with all kinds of limitations. And what you'll notice whenever you go into a courtroom involving a case in Massachusetts where there is news coverage is that there is usually. And again, I might be dating myself a little bit because the pool rules were very, very clear back when I was reporting. There'd be one camera, and the other news organizations would have to have the opportunity to share in whatever that one camera was able to record. Because clerks of courts, court officers, and judges have the right to make sure that the public gets the most orderly administration of justice possible. The rest of us and news organizations have a constitutionally protected First Amendment right in a series of rights, and also the defendant has a right to a public trial. So these rights are balanced by different rules in different places. And in federal court, what they've said is you can draw pictures, but we're not letting recording devices in the courtroom.
Almost seems archaic that we're still going to see the photos of Whitey Bulger perhaps in an orange suit. I'd probably be wearing something better.
Not even photos. Chucks.
That's what I meant. Not photos. We're talking about actual sketches. It almost seems archaic. Why is it that they won't allow cameras in the courtroom, even just one?
Because
you'd almost think they'd want a record of it, even for themselves.
Oh, they've got a record for it. They've got a court reporter keeping a transcript of it, and they know that escalated media coverage, especially these days, does not necessarily build a clean record.
Let's kind of talk about that, Betsy. The amount of news coverage out there right now, 24-hour news stations. Everybody wants to be the first with the story, and that sometimes compromises the story itself. With the internet and many news, we mentioned Reddit off-air, I believe.
Yes, that's
right. With the case of Sunil Tripathi, who was wrongly accused, of being one of the Boston Marathon bombers who was found dead in a Providence River.
Horrible situation.
And we can only assume that he committed suicide due to this. Do you see a pattern here happening where it's kind of, instead of getting the right story, they just want to be the first to get it?
Well, and not only that, but people just want to say something. And frankly, I've thought for a while that we're listening to the wrong folks and not hearing enough from ones who are more fair-minded and know a little better what they're talking about. And I hope to see that shift a little bit. But that's nothing that can ever be mandated by government in a free society. That's something that is only a matter of the marketplace and improving the appetite for accurate news coverage. And, I was fond of saying when I did talk radio as a fill-in host that, it was the most boring 2 hours of talk radio because I had guests talking about information and people calling in and, and there was usually some information that got out there, but it wasn't all, sparkly and fireworky. And so people using who are portrayed as news reporters or portraying themselves as news reporters that are using all kinds of adjectives and superlatives in their language. I'd like to think that we'll get to a point where that's the thing that makes our attention wander rather than, too much measured commentary without video.
This was interesting. Our very own Ron Van Dam joined Twitter particularly because of this. Never seen anything like this before. This is something that could only happen circa 2013. There was an official Jodi Arias Twitter account that her friends operated where she would relay information to them from prison, and they would write what was portrayed as Jodi Arias' thoughts on her particular case that came to a conclusion a few weeks ago at this point. That was just a horrific case about some horrific events. Don't think we'll be seeing an official Whitey Bulger Twitter, but you never know.
You never know. You never know indeed. I mean, it's a different era, a different generation, and some of the old wise guys that people are talking to really harken back to the old days of crime reporting and the old days of organized crime. Not necessarily the good old days, but the old days, as it were. But I think he's going to be convicted. I think it's going to be a long trial. I think he, too, like Keith Luke, is going to get a spirited defense. I also think he's a monster, and he should be convicted, and I think he will be.
Well, Betsy, I want to thank you so much for spending the better part of 2 hours with us here on a Monday morning, talking about your days as a news personality here on AM 1460, back when the call letters were WBET, and talking about your current life as a lawyer and offering us some legal insight into some significant trials taking place. Is there any final words for our listeners you'd like to leave them with this morning in relation to your time here at AM 1460 as a radio news host and also as what you're doing currently?
Well, the reason I sent you the email that I sent, and the reason I've been so interested in having the station come back on the air after dead air and really, unreliable things happening prior to that, is because I know that the city of Brockton and the Metro South region deserve a strong radio station and deserve strong news coverage. And I think that this is the place that they're going to get it, ultimately. I hope, if they're going to get it anywhere. I think that community radio, when I look at other markets, is on its way back. I love radio anyway. But I have to say that it is the glue, and it is an important glue in this community where we have such a wonderful and reasonably, actually very well-educated populace that are just looking for a way to come together. And I think that that's what radio can do. When I was on the radio every day, I was about your age and a little bit older. Actually, no, I was about your age. And as much as I enjoyed the way we were able to operate as a glue to the community, I never would have been able to guess, because of where I was in my life at that time, how important that would be for the people who are listening, the people who are becoming informed, the people who were spurred to action or determined that they would care. We did a lot with Neighborhood Watch at the time, and it brought people together. It brought people together for their schools and for their community, and it's made this city of Brockton, or it's been part of what's made this city of Brockton such a unique and wonderful place to raise a family and to live in a neighborhood and to connect with people. And it is such an important ingredient. The local radio, local coverage, local responsible discussion and analysis of news issues is so important to this community. It needs to happen.
Well, Betsy, I thank you so much for spending some time with us here this morning. We'll have to do this again sometime, particularly as this Whitey Bulger case continues on in the coming months.
Happy to. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That's Betsy Zullas joining us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR, former WBET news personality, now Betsy Clague, a local lawyer with offices on Main Street. Why don't you give that plug one more time?
Well, thanks. 142 Main Street, Suite 304. It's an old building known as the Kennedy Building. It's right across the street from John Marion's Tuxedos by Marion's Tux Shop, right upstairs from Hoagie's Hobbies. Kay's Click is there. Independence Associates is there. There's a new coffee shop opening.
You've got some eclectic neighbors.
Those, I'll tell you, things are starting to happen in downtown Brockton. That's where my office is, and that's where it's going to stay.
That's Betsy Zullas joining us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. You're listening to the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Czymbor and Mike Paiva here with you on this Monday morning. Just a half hour of show left to go. We'll step aside. Mike Paiva will actually join us with a local news update. Stick with us. More of the program after this.